I thought my birthday would be easy this year. No arguments, no tension, just one night where I could breathe. The restaurant glowed with soft lights, glasses clinking, familiar faces smiling back at me. People laughed. Someone toasted my name. From the outside, my life looked perfect. Ethan stood beside me, his arm resting at my waist. To anyone watching, it was a picture of stability. But I felt it, the subtle pressure of his grip, the way his smile never reached his eyes. Then his mother leaned in and whispered something to him. I didn't hear the words, but I saw the change. His shoulders stiffened, his jaw tightened. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by something cold and obedient. That was the moment I knew. Whatever she had just said wasn't meant for me. It was meant to remind him who he belonged to. And as the room kept laughing, unaware, I realized this birthday wasn't going to end the way anyone expected, especially not my husband. People loved to tell me how lucky I was. They said it with smiles, with envy tucked politely behind compliments. You and Ethan are such a great couple. You're living the dream, Grace. He takes such good care of you. I used to thank them. I used to believe it myself. From the outside, our marriage looked effortless. Ethan had a good job, a calm voice, and the kind of polite charm that made people trust him instantly. He opened doors. He remembered birthdays. He never raised his voice in public. At home, he was quiet, not cruel, not loud, just absent in a way that slowly hollowed the space between us. Most of that absence came from one place: his mother. Margaret Miller never needed to announce her authority. It lived in the way Ethan straightened when she entered a room, the way his opinions softened after a short phone call with her. She never criticized me directly. She didn't have to. Her comments were always wrapped in concern. I just worry about Grace, she would say, placing a hand lightly on Ethan's arm. She's very sensitive. You know how important stability is for a marriage. Stability. That word followed me everywhere. If I disagreed with Ethan, I was being emotional. If I questioned a decision, I was creating tension. If I asked for space, I was being dramatic. And slowly, without realizing it, I learned to edit myself. I stopped correcting him in front of others. I stopped sharing certain thoughts. I smiled when Margaret gave advice that felt less like guidance and more like instruction. It was easier that way, quieter. The night of my birthday party, that quiet felt heavier than usual. As guests arrived, Margaret moved through the room like she owned it, directing servers, adjusting decorations, correcting small details that no one else would have noticed. This was supposed to be my celebration, but somehow it had become another performance she was managing. Ethan stayed close to her, checking in with his eyes before making even the smallest decision. Relax, I whispered to him at one point, trying to sound light. It's just dinner. He smiled, but it was the same practiced smile I'd seen too many times lately. Mom just wants everything to go smoothly, he said. Smoothly. Another word that meant don't disrupt the order. I watched our friends laugh, glasses raised, cameras flashing. No one saw the tension beneath the surface. No one noticed how often Ethan glanced toward his mother, or how rarely he looked at me unless someone else was watching. That was when I understood something I'd been avoiding for a long time. This marriage wasn't breaking loudly. It was being quietly controlled. And the scariest part wasn't Margaret's influence. It was how normal it had all started to feel. Standing there, surrounded by people who thought they knew my life, I realized that whatever was coming next had been building for a long time. I just didn't know yet how public it was going to become. Pressure doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives quietly, wrapped in politeness and concern, until one day you realize you've been holding your breath for years. After our wedding, the rules began to form, unspoken but unmistakable. Ethan never said you're not allowed. He didn't have to. Every time I crossed an invisible line, the consequences appeared gently, almost kindly. A long silence. A disappointed look. A conversation that somehow ended with me apologizing. Margaret perfected that method. If I wore something she didn't approve of, she smiled and said, "Oh, it's bold. I just hope Ethan's colleagues understand your personality." If I mentioned wanting to travel alone for a few days, she tilted her head and said, "Marriage is about sacrifice, Grace. Independence can be misunderstood." Misunderstood. That word followed stability closely. Ethan never defended me, not openly. Later, in private, he'd say things like, "She didn't mean it that way," Or, "You know how sensitive mom is," as if her feelings carried more weight than my discomfort. At first, I pushed back. I tried explaining how small comments added up, how being constantly evaluated made me doubt myself. Ethan would listen, nodding thoughtfully, his expression soft. For a moment, I'd feel hopeful. Then his phone would buzz. Sometimes he'd step into another room to answer it. Sometimes he wouldn't even hide it. Afterward, the conversation would shift. His tone cooled. His posture changed. "You're overthinking it," he'd say. "You're reading too much into things. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be." And just like that, the problem stopped being what was said to me and became my reaction to it. That was when I started to feel truly alone. I began paying attention to patterns instead of arguments, to timing instead of tone. Ethan was most distant after family dinners, most agreeable when Margaret praised him, most rigid when she expressed concern about me. The realization unsettled me. This wasn't conflict, it was conditioning. I noticed it in myself too. I rehearsed conversations in my head before speaking. I softened my words preemptively. I measured my emotions, trimming them down to something more acceptable. I was becoming quieter, not because I wanted peace, but because I wanted safety. The first time I spoke to Daniel Ross, it wasn't dramatic. He was a family friend who happened to be a lawyer. We met for coffee under the excuse of catching up. "I just need advice," I told him, my hands wrapped tightly around my cup. Nothing serious. He listened without interrupting as I described my marriage, not the obvious problems but the subtle ones. The constant second-guessing. The way decisions were made around me instead of with me. When I finished, he didn't rush to label anything. "What you're describing," he said carefully, "is pressure that leaves no bruises. That doesn't make it harmless." That sentence stayed with me. Daniel explained my options not dramatically, not urgently. He talked about documentation, about boundaries, about the importance of witnesses if things escalated. "Control thrives in isolation," he said. "The moment other people can see it, everything changes." I didn't know then how important that advice would become. By the time my birthday approached, the pressure felt heavier than ever. Margaret had insisted on organizing the dinner herself. Ethan agreed before I could respond. "It's easier this way," he said. "She knows what she's doing." Easier for whom? I wondered. In the days leading up to the party, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief clarity. The kind that comes when you stop hoping things will magically improve and start accepting them for what they are. I began saving messages. Not the obvious ones, the subtle ones. The reminders, the corrections. The moments that made my stomach tighten even though no one raised their voice. I told myself I was just being cautious. But deep down, I knew the truth. Something was reaching its breaking point. And whether I was ready or not, the silence that had kept everything neatly contained was running out of space. There's a moment before everything changes when the world still looks the same. That's where I was. In the weeks leading up to my birthday, nothing dramatic happened. No shouting, no confrontations. Just the same careful dance I'd been performing for years, only now, I was watching instead of reacting. Ethan assumed my quiet meant acceptance. "You've been calmer lately," he said one night, almost relieved. "I knew you'd come around." I smiled and said nothing. What he didn't know was that silence had stopped being surrender. It had become strategy. I began paying attention to details I used to ignore. Who spoke for me? Who decided for me? How often my name was used as justification instead of invitation. Margaret called daily as the party approached. "We'll keep it intimate," she said. "Nothing overwhelming for you." She chose the restaurant, the guest list, even the seating arrangement. I let her. Each decision was another thread she wrapped around herself, one she didn't realize could be traced. The night before my birthday, Ethan found me organizing old documents at the kitchen table. "Why are you up so late?" he asked. "I couldn't sleep," I said truthfully. He glanced at the papers but didn't ask questions. He never did when something didn't fit his expectations. He preferred not to look too closely. That was the pattern. Avoid discomfort. Trust authority. Maintain appearances. I met Daniel once more, briefly, under the pretense of returning a book. "You don't look scared anymore," he observed. "I'm not," I replied. "I'm prepared." He nodded, then said something that felt heavier than advice. "Whatever happens, Remember this: how someone behaves when they think they're untouchable tells the clearest story. I carried that sentence with me into my birthday evening. The restaurant was full of familiar faces, friends, colleagues, extended family. Laughter floated easily. Glasses were raised. Someone asked me to make a wish. I looked at Ethan before answering. He smiled, confident, relaxed. He thought the night belonged to him and to his mother's careful planning. I already have everything I need, I said. Margaret smiled approvingly. Ethan squeezed my hand, just a little too tightly. Then she leaned toward him. I didn't hear her words. I didn't need to. I saw his expression change, the same way it always did. The shift was subtle, practiced. He straightened, his jaw setting as if a decision had just been made for him. Whatever she said reminded him of his role: the obedient son, the controlled husband, the man who never questioned the hand that guided him. I felt it then, not fear, not anger, but clarity. This was the moment, not the explosion, not the aftermath. The point of no return. As the room continued laughing, unaware, I took a slow breath and let myself relax. Because for the first time in years, I knew something they didn't. Control only works when no one is watching. And this time, everyone was. People often say you remember every detail of a moment like that. They're wrong. What I remember most is the silence. 1 second, the room was alive, forks tapping plates, laughter overlapping, someone calling my name from across the table. I was smiling out of habit, my body moving on autopilot. Then, everything fractured. There was a sharp sound, too sudden, too close, and my world tilted. I didn't fully understand what had happened until my feet failed me and I felt myself falling. The floor rushed up faster than my thoughts. Cold, hard, unforgiving. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. My mind hadn't caught up yet. What filled me first wasn't pain, but shock, the kind that steals the air from your lungs and leaves your ears ringing. The room went dead silent. Not an awkward pause. Not confusion. A complete, stunned stillness. I could feel dozens of eyes on me. Someone sucked in a breath sharply. A chair scraped backward. A glass shattered somewhere, forgotten. I lifted my head slowly. Ethan was standing exactly where he had been, his body locked in place. His hand hovered midair, fingers curled as if frozen in the act. His face had gone pale, too pale, his confidence draining away second by second. That was when it hit him. Not remorse. Not concern. Realization. He wasn't in our living room. He wasn't protected by walls or excuses. He wasn't alone with me. He was surrounded. Margaret's reaction was almost worse than his. She didn't rush toward me. She didn't call my name. She didn't ask if I was okay. She inhaled slowly, lips pressed together, eyes darting across the room, not to me, but to the people watching. To the phones already halfway lifted. To the expressions shifting from confusion to judgment. Damage control. Always. Grace? Someone whispered. Oh my God. Another voice murmured. I stayed on the floor longer than necessary. Not because I couldn't get up, but because I wanted them to see it. Every second stretched unbearably long. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of us. No one knew what to do yet, and that uncertainty made the truth impossible to ignore. Then, before I could stop myself, a sound slipped out of me. A laugh. Low, slow, almost surprised. It wasn't hysterical. It wasn't broken. It wasn't loud. It was calm, and it terrified him. Ethan's eyes snapped to mine, wide and unfocused. His mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. The version of me he thought he knew, the quiet one, the careful one, wasn't supposed to make that sound. Grace? He started, his voice shaking now. This isn't. Don't, I said. It was the first word I'd spoken, and it cut through the room sharper than any sound before it. I pushed myself up slowly, ignoring the hands reaching toward me, the questions tumbling out all at once. Are you hurt? Should we call someone? Did anyone see? Everyone had seen. I stood there, steadying myself against the table, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the entire room could hear it. Ethan took a step toward me. Security was already moving. Please, he said quickly, his voice dropping into the familiar tone, the one he used when he wanted to sound reasonable. Let's talk. This doesn't have to become something it's not. That sentence told me everything. Not, are you okay? Not, I'm sorry. Just fear of consequences. Margaret finally spoke. Grace, she said sharply, trying to regain control. You're making a scene. I turned toward her. For the first time, I didn't soften my expression. I didn't smile. I didn't make myself smaller to keep the peace. No, I said evenly. I didn't make this. Her eyes flickered just for a moment. Around us, people were already pulling out phones. Someone had called the manager. Someone else whispered about calling the police. The word witnesses hung heavy in the air. Ethan realized it at the same time I did. This wasn't something he could explain away later. This wasn't something I could be convinced to forget. This moment belonged to everyone now. His shoulders slumped slightly, the authority he'd borrowed from his mother evaporating under the weight of public scrutiny. I didn't mean to, he tried again. I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. You meant to control me, I said. You just didn't mean for them to see it. No one interrupted. No one defended him. That silence, the kind that follows truth, wrapped around us tighter than any argument ever had. As security gently guided him back, as people surrounded me with concern and outrage, one thought rang louder than anything else in my mind. The thing he feared most had finally happened. He had been exposed. And whatever came next, I would not be facing it alone. Silence doesn't end when the noise stops. It lingers. Long after Ethan was led away from the center of the room, after the manager closed the doors to keep the crowd from spilling outside, after someone wrapped a jacket around my shoulders, I could still feel it humming beneath my skin. A quiet awareness. Everything had changed. People spoke to me gently now, as if volume alone might break something fragile. Someone pressed a glass of water into my hands. Another woman, someone I barely knew, kept repeating, "You're safe. You're safe," as if saying it enough times would make it instantly true. The police arrived quickly. Not in a rush, not in chaos. Calm, professional, exactly the opposite of how I felt inside. They separated us without asking me to explain myself first. That mattered more than I realized at the time. One officer stayed with me, his voice steady, his questions clear and measured. "Can you tell me what happened, in your own words?" he asked. So I did. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't minimize it either. I described the moment, the lack of warning, the witnesses. I pointed out the people who had seen everything, the phones that had captured pieces of it, the staff who had been standing just feet away. As I spoke, I noticed something strange. I wasn't shaking anymore. Ethan tried to talk his way out of it. I heard his voice from across the room, low, defensive, carefully constructed. I recognized the rhythm, the same one he'd used with me for years. Calm. Reasonable. Almost convincing. Almost. But this time, it wasn't just my word against his. It was ours against the room. Margaret hovered near him, her face tight with restrained fury. She whispered sharply, gesturing with controlled movements, as if directing a performance. When an officer asked her to step back, she bristled. "I'm his mother," she said. "This is a misunderstanding." The officer didn't flinch. "Ma'am," he replied evenly, "this is an investigation." That sentence landed like a crack through glass. For the first time, Margaret had no authority here. After statements were taken, Ethan was escorted out. The room felt lighter without him, though my chest still ached with the weight of what had just happened. Someone asked if I wanted to press charges. The question wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was presented as a choice, my choice. I remembered Daniel's words. Control thrives in isolation. "I want to document everything," I said, "and I want to know my options." The officer nodded approvingly. That's a good place to start. In the hours that followed, I learned how much protection I'd been denied, simply because I hadn't known it existed. They explained restraining orders, temporary housing options, victim advocacy services, the importance of medical documentation even when injuries weren't visible. One of the officers looked me straight in the eye. "What happened to you matters," she said. "And it matters that it happened in public. Not because it was worse, but because it was undeniable." Daniel arrived before the restaurant finally emptied. He didn't rush me. He didn't tell me what to do. He listened. "Tonight doesn't define you," he said quietly. "But it does give you leverage. And safety." That word again. Safety. Later that night, alone in a quiet room that wasn't my home, I stared at my phone as messages poured in. friends, colleagues, people who had seen everything. Are you okay? I'm so sorry. If you need anything, call me. There were also messages from Ethan. Long ones. Short ones. Apologies tangled with explanations. Fear disguised as regret. I didn't respond. For once, silence belonged to me. The next morning, I met with a victim advocate. She spoke gently but directly, outlining steps I could take, reminding me that recovery wasn't a straight line. You didn't cause this, she said, and you don't have to carry it alone. I realized then how much of my marriage had been built on the opposite belief, that I was responsible for keeping things calm, that my reactions mattered more than his actions, that harmony was worth any personal cost. That illusion shattered the moment witnesses entered the picture. Margaret tried to contact me later that day. Her message was short. We need to talk. This has gone too far. I read it once, then I deleted it. For the first time, her voice had no power over me. In the days that followed, the story spread not as gossip, but as truth. Not exaggerated, not softened, just real. And with every conversation, every document filed, every boundary set, I felt something unfamiliar growing inside me. Not anger, not revenge. Stability. Real stability built on accountability, not silence. I didn't know yet how long the process would take. I didn't know how complicated things would become. But I knew this. The moment Ethan raised his hand, he lost control. The moment I laughed, I reclaimed mine. And whatever came next, courtrooms, conversations, healing, I would be walking into it, supported, protected, and finally seen. Recovery doesn't arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, quiet mornings, steady breaths, small decisions that remind you who you were before everything became about survival. The first night I slept in my own space, temporary, unfamiliar, but safe. I didn't dream. I woke before dawn, heart racing out of habit, then slowly realized no one was there to monitor my movements, my tone, my silence. That realization felt heavier than fear. In the days that followed, my life became a series of appointments and choices. Meetings with my lawyer. Check-ins with a victim advocate. Conversations I'd once avoided now happening openly, with witnesses and documentation. Each step grounded me. The restraining order was granted quickly, not because of emotion but because of evidence. Witness statements. Time-stamped messages. Video clips sent by people who hadn't hesitated to speak up when it mattered. The system moved carefully, but it moved. That mattered. Ethan tried to regain control through words. His emails were longer now, more polished. Apologies layered with justification. I've been under a lot of pressure. You know, my mother didn't mean for this to happen. We can fix this privately. Privately. That word no longer tempted me. My lawyer advised no direct contact. I followed that advice strictly. Boundaries weren't cruelty, they were protection. Margaret's attempts were subtler. She reached out through relatives. Through mutual friends. Always with the same message disguised in different tones. Family matters should stay within the family. Dragging this into public view helps no one. What she meant was clear. Exposure had cost her influence. For the first time, I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my choices. I simply said no. That word, short, clean, final, became my anchor. Therapy became part of my routine, not as a reaction but as reconstruction. I learned how control reshapes perception, how constant minimization trains you to distrust your own instincts. The therapist didn't rush me toward forgiveness. She asked better questions. When did you stop feeling like you had the right to take up space? When did safety become something you negotiated instead of expected? Those questions stayed with me long after the sessions ended. I began to notice my voice again. Not the one I used to keep things calm, but the one that surfaced when I was alone, speaking without rehearsal. I practiced saying my own thoughts out loud, hearing them without interruption. They sounded stronger than I remembered. The legal process continued steadily. Ethan's version of events shifted as evidence accumulated. What started as denial turned into minimization, then into quiet compliance. His confidence dissolved in proportion to the clarity of the record. For the first time, he had to respond instead of control. Friends stepped forward in ways I hadn't expected. People I'd once thought were distant told me they'd noticed things, how I flinched at certain tones, how I checked in with Ethan before answering simple questions. They hadn't known what to call it then. Now they did, and they were watching closely. That visibility changed everything. One afternoon, as I sat reviewing documents with Daniel, he paused and looked at me thoughtfully. "You're different," he said. I smiled faintly. "I don't feel different." "You are," he replied. "You're not asking for permission anymore." He was right. I no longer waited for approval before speaking. I no longer softened truths to make them easier to accept. I trusted my instincts again, not because they were perfect, but because they were mine. The process wasn't painless. Some nights were heavy with grief for the marriage I thought I had, for the version of myself I'd slowly erased. Other nights, anger surfaced unexpectedly, sharp and exhausting. But beneath it all, something steadier was forming. Confidence. Not loud, not performative. Quiet and unmovable. I stopped thinking about what Ethan or his mother might say next. Their voices had faded into background noise, distant, irrelevant. My focus shifted forward, toward accountability, toward independence, toward a future built on transparency instead of tolerance. One evening, as I stood in front of the mirror, I caught my own reflection and held my gaze. "I'm here," I said aloud. It wasn't a declaration, it was a promise. And as the final legal steps approached, I understood something with startling clarity. This story was no longer about what had been taken from me. It was about what I was reclaiming. My voice, my agency, my life, and I was ready to carry it into the light. Courtrooms don't feel dramatic when you're inside them. They feel controlled, measured, unforgiving in their neutrality. That morning, as I sat on the wooden bench waiting for my name to be called, I noticed how different my body felt compared to the night of my birthday. My hands were steady, my breathing even. The chaos had been replaced by structure, and structure felt like safety. Ethan entered with his attorney, his posture stiff, his confidence carefully assembled. He avoided my eyes. Margaret sat behind him, her presence quieter than it had ever been. She wasn't directing anything now. She was observing, calculating, limited by rules she couldn't bend. The judge reviewed the records slowly. Witness statements, security footage, messages sent after the incident. No raised voices, no theatrics, just facts. When Ethan's attorney spoke, the language was cautious, defensive, stress, miscommunication. A moment taken out of context. I listened without reacting. Then it was my turn. I stood, feeling the weight of the room shift not toward drama but toward attention. I didn't embellish. I didn't plead. I spoke clearly, steadily, describing not just the incident, but the pattern that led to it, the quiet control, the isolation, the way authority had been outsourced to someone else's approval. When I finished, the judge looked directly at Ethan. "This court is not here to excuse behavior," she said calmly. "It is here to assess responsibility." Margaret's face tightened. Ethan finally looked up. For the first time, I saw something close to understanding in his expression, not empathy, but realization. The recognition that the narrative he'd relied on no longer protected him. The ruling was precise. The restraining order remained in place. Conditions were set, boundaries formalized, consequences clearly outlined. No room for interpretation. As the gavel came down, I felt an unexpected surge, not triumph, not relief, but closure. Outside the courtroom, people waited. Not reporters, not spectacle. Friends, supporters, witnesses. They didn't cheer. They didn't question. They simply stood with me. Ethan left through another exit. Margaret followed, her head held high, but her influence finally stripped of effect. The system had spoken in a language she couldn't override. In the days that followed, the story settled into truth. Not whispered, not exaggerated, documented. Ethan's social circle shifted. People who once laughed at his jokes now asked harder questions. Some distanced themselves quietly. Others reached out to me privately, apologizing for what they hadn't recognized sooner. I didn't demand their guilt. Awareness was enough. One message stayed with me. "I saw how calm you were in court," someone wrote. "It made me realize how long you must have been carrying this alone." They were right. But I wasn't carrying it anymore. I began closing chapters, financial accounts separated, living arrangements finalized, legal ties carefully undone. Each signature felt less like loss and more like release. Margaret attempted one final message through a mutual acquaintance. She says she hopes you can move on without destroying the family, the person told me carefully. I smiled, calm and unshaken. I already have, I replied. That night, alone in my new apartment, I opened the windows and let fresh air fill the space. The city hummed outside, life continuing, indifferent and full of possibility. I thought about the woman I'd been when this story began, the one who edited herself, the one who confused silence with peace, the one who believed endurance was the same as strength. She hadn't been weak. She had been waiting, waiting for witnesses, waiting for clarity, waiting for the courage that comes when truth finally steps into the open. The reckoning wasn't about punishment. It was about recognition. And as I turned off the lights and settled into the quiet, I understood something I hadn't before. Justice doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrives calmly and stays. People often ask what happened after everything became public. They expect something dramatic: revenge, regret, a perfectly tied ending. The truth is quieter and far more powerful. Months passed. Life reorganized itself around honesty instead of fear. My new routine was simple: work I chose, people I trusted, and a home where silence felt safe instead of heavy. I stopped bracing myself for reactions that never came. No one monitored my tone. No one corrected my choices. No one demanded explanations. Freedom, I learned, doesn't announce itself. It settles in. Ethan complied with every condition the court imposed. There were no surprise messages, no attempts to rewrite history. The legal boundaries held, exactly as they were meant to. That was the point of them: not revenge, but protection. I never saw him again. And I didn't need to. Margaret faded from my life entirely. Her name still appeared occasionally in social circles, in conversations that grew awkward and then quiet, but her influence over me was gone. Power, I realized, only works when it's fed attention. I stopped feeding it. What surprised me most was how many people reached out afterward, not with gossip, but with recognition. Women, men, colleagues, friends of friends. I thought I was overreacting, they told me. I didn't know it counted if it wasn't constant. I didn't think anyone would believe me. 8-12. I didn't give them advice. I gave them information. About documenting behavior. About knowing their rights. About speaking to professionals before confronting situations alone. About how the law exists not just to punish, but to protect. Because one of the most dangerous myths we're taught is that strength means enduring quietly. It doesn't. Strength is knowing when to stop negotiating with harm. I learned that laughter, real laughter, can be a boundary. That calm can be louder than shouting. That the moment someone tries to humiliate you publicly, they've already underestimated you. Most importantly, I learned this: no one loses control accidentally. And no one regains it by staying silent. If you're watching this and something in my story feels uncomfortably familiar, let me be clear about one thing. You don't need a dramatic moment for your experience to matter. You don't need witnesses to deserve safety. And you don't need permission to protect yourself. Help can look like a lawyer, or a counselor, or a trusted friend, or a single decision to stop explaining what shouldn't have happened in the first place. My birthday didn't end the way I expected, but it gave me something better than a celebration. It gave me my voice back. And that laugh, the one that stopped everything, it wasn't about him. It was the sound of me realizing I was finally free. Final message, value takeaway. This story is fictional and dramatized, created for awareness and reflection. If you or someone you know is experiencing emotional harm, coercive control, or unsafe behavior, consider seeking professional, legal, or support resources in your area. You are not weak for needing help. You are not dramatic for setting boundaries. And you are never wrong for choosing safety. Silence protects harm. Truth protects people. And choosing yourself, that's not the end of the story. That's the beginning.